Okay, welcome to another Live Talks Los Angeles conversation. With me today is Paul Pringle, a Los Angeles Times reporter who specializes in investigation and investigating corruption. His book is Bad City: Peril and Power in the City of Angels. So, Paul, before we start, I think a good way to start would be give me your sense, and let's sort of go back to the time when this items in the book happened and describe the leadership at USC and also at the Los Angeles Times. And then if you touch on, I know it's not a big part of the book, the nature of the leadership at, say, at the Pasadena Police Department.
Well, in each case, it wasn't good. Started at USC. I had been writing about USC for some time on other matters and never had anything close to transparency on the university's end. Certainly, I'm talking about the leadership now. So I knew when I got this tip, when this tip was forwarded to me, that it would be a challenge to get the people who run USC to cooperate, even though in a normal situation, they certainly should. In terms of the Los Angeles Times, we were in very bad shape at that point. We were owned by Tronc. The leadership in the newsroom was extremely unpopular, um, more or less divorced from the staff on an ongoing basis. And I knew that would be a challenge as well. And then there were other institutions who I believe their leaders failed in their mission. That included the Pasadena Police Department, Pasadena City Hall in general, later on the District Attorney's Office, even the State Attorney General's Office, as this case unfolded.
So from at the time that you got the tip, I recall reading in the book that one of your concerns was, who else might be on the case, and there was the risk of another outlet possibly getting to this story.
Oh, yes. After the tip came in, I almost immediately went down to Pasadena, figuring I could get the bare bones information that you would normally get on a police matter. And, it wouldn't take me very long at all to get at least the initial story finished. But instead, I encountered, a stone wall. The only record they would give me was a call to service log, which was heavily redacted, really wasn't much use at all, except for the fact that it did verify the times and dates, the information from the whistleblower who was the source of the tip. So that set me on, a course of knocking on doors, making lots of phone calls, sending emails. And the more you do that, the more concerned you become that a rival outlet will learn of this and will beat you to the punch. You'll be scooped. So that was always a concern I had. And that went on for quite some time. I kind of lucked out.
So as I mentioned, we do a lot of events around books here at Live Talks Los Angeles. I notice when people start opining and commenting on books and in social media, I started seeing a pattern of pro-con reaction to your book. What struck me was there was this fine line. People were either very supportive of you and the book, and of people extremely critical of the book, and more so of the issues you raised with the Los Angeles Times and necessarily USC. So I heard the entire audiobook in one trip up to Oregon, and then on the trip back, we spent a lot of time talking about what was in the book. So let's just talk about the criticism you received. And the typical reader isn't privy or aware to the book writing process. Some of the criticism said, "Oh, there is no fact checking involved in this." So could you share with us what is fact checking when it say as compared to writing for the paper versus writing a book?
Well, first of all of the criticism, and there hasn't been much of it, it's certainly been drowned out by the praise for the book. All of it is coming from the three editors who were fired at the LA Times after I and my colleagues complained about how they handled this story, among other things. And it's been echoed by a few of their cronies who've given them a platform in our industry. And that's all it is. Nothing they have said, nothing they have posted online has or ever will change a single word in the book. The book is absolutely true when it comes to what these editors did and what happened to them as a result. And that's it. In terms of fact checking, this you know this book was fact checked to death, to over a period of months, word for word, line by line, and it also underwent multiple rounds of legal review. So again, it's solid. It's the criticism that's come at me from these fired editors and their pals will never lead to a correction. Again, there'll never be a word change in the book because of this. They're simply trying to preserve their reputations, restore their reputations, what have you.
All right, let's give us some background, Paul, from when you submitted what you thought was a ready for publication article to when the article was finally published. How much time?
Well, first of all, I encountered a complete cover-up on behalf of USC and a near complete cover-up at the city of Pasadena. That went on for months. I got the tip in early April. As the book points out, the Pasadena Police Department didn't even file a report on this overdose, and they only did so. They did so 3 months after the fact, and only because I kept banging on their door. And even then, they withheld it from me for nearly another 2 months. So I had to get through that, and I did. I finally got my hands on that report. I got my hands on 2 911 recordings. I had the whistleblower's account. I had statements from the spokesperson for the police department as well as for the city. So at that point, I had a complete story. It wasn't the only story that I expected to file on this, but my 2 immediate editors and I put together this story. I filed the draft in October, and it was ready for publication within a couple of weeks after that. But again, it sat around, which had become a pattern with stories on USC under the leadership of this newsroom, until I would complain about how long it was taking to get it published. Eventually, it went to the managing editor, edited it several times. We had some battles over that. He tried to stop me from going to the home of the president of USC, who was not responding to my emails or phone calls, which was outrageous on behalf of the editor. So anyway, the story was supposed to run in February, finally, and at the very last moment, the top editor killed it. He didn't call me in and say, oh, we just need to do this or that. He just killed the story and tried to get me to move on to something else. In fact, when I first told him about the story months earlier, he tried to persuade me to move on to something else. So that led to a huge battle. I threatened to involve the entire newsroom in it. My editor, Matt Late, the city editor at the time, stood behind me. And so eventually, in this very heated meeting, the top editor said, well, he's not closing the door to further reporting. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. What should have happened was the opposite. The minute he heard about this story, he should have been enthusiastic about it, given me all the support I needed, and let's get this thing in the paper as soon as possible. This doctor was hurting people. He was hurting people. And the longer that story stayed unpublished, the more people he hurt.
Was there a single reason the top editor wanted this story not to run?
No, he actually started the meeting, as the book points out, with these statements about how I should be grateful for the support he's given me in the past. It wasn't a story meeting at all. He was calling me in and he said, we're not going to publish this story. And then, of course, I went nuts over that. And my editor was also in the meeting, Matt Lade. He was the calm one in the meeting. And if we hadn't pushed back as hard as we did, that story would have stayed killed. Now he's lying about it. He said, well, he just wanted me to get the identity of the woman. That didn't come up. And in fact, later on, when we did get the identity of the woman, the story still stayed out of the paper for 3.5 months. So anyway, as Bad City points out, we were so determined to get this story published that we defied the top editors and put together a secret reporting team, sort of flood the zone to get whatever we could to make the story unkillable. And that's what happened.
You mentioned that other stories USC related had either been stalled or writers had been dissuaded against pursuing them. Can you give me any examples of those? I mean, personally, I do recall I would hear some incident would happen at USC. They'd announce some investigation, some big law firm personality will be attached to it. and then we never hear about the outcome of that investigation. So I'm just curious what other USC related stories sort of went undercovered or not covered.
Well, there's one in Bad City that I point to by my colleague Nathan Fenno. This is a very important story that could not have been more topical at the time. It was about the alleged overuse of drugs in the athletic department on athletes. It was based almost entirely on court records, public records, unassailable. And he filed the story. His editors loved it. It went up the chain of command to the managing editor, and there it died. And he was never given a reason.
Somewhere in Big City, I recall one of the arguments against moving forward, or at least moving forward cautiously, was the nature of the dean of the school, Carmen Puliafito, being a private citizen versus a public person. Is there a difference in, or tell us what that difference in how, when is somebody considered public enough to write about?
No, that came from one of the lower ranking. That was ridiculous. Number one, he's the dean of one of the largest medical schools in the country. He's a public figure, and even if he were not a public figure, this story makes him one. He was running this very important institution. At the same time, he was providing drugs to young people, engaging in other types of criminal activity, again hurting people, even as he was performing surgeries and otherwise treating patients. So no, this is exactly the type of story that we do. And we get it into the paper as quickly and as judiciously as possible, which did not happen here.
What is, other than being two prominent institutions in this great city, and I mean, USC is not a large financial advertising partner at the LA Times, or are they? What is the nature of the USC LA Times relationship? What financial deals are in place?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers, but they were, I believe, a substantial advertiser back then anyway. And of course, we had this partnership with USC with our book festival. There are other ties between the university and the newspaper. People who work for the LA Times teach at USC. People whose careers ended at the LA Times often go on to USC for a second career. And the history of the two institutions is intertwined. So there are a lot of connections, and a lot of them are good. In this story, again, my immediate editor, Matt Lade, taught at USC. Two of the members of the reporting team we put together are USC grads. So many of the ties between the two institutions are good. But in this case, we had another problem where under Tronc, the editor of the LA Times was also named publisher. So now he is straddling that wall that is supposed to be impenetrable between the newsroom and the newspaper's financial operations. And that creates a lot of problems. It creates at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. And after I initiated this corporate investigation over how they handled the USC story, and they were fired, that combination of roles was eliminated.
I've attended the book festival at USC, and before that, when it was at UCLA. And the publisher of the paper has, a rather prominent role at the book prizes, the Friday night of the festival. So as I'm reading this and I'm seeing these delays, it sort of struck me that it would be awfully embarrassing if this story came out before the book festival, and for the publisher at the time to be in this very public place on the Friday night before the festival, as well as, USC having a stage at the festival, I suppose, and, how the public might react about this story. Do you think that specifically may have contributed to wanting to delay this?
Well, it was certainly in the back of my mind and in the minds of my colleagues. The story was ready for publication during the book festival. And I mean the second version of the story. After I found the young woman who overdosed, and I got my hands on the videos and photos showing the dean doing drugs, providing drugs to others. We had multiple on-the-record accounts of this occurring. I mean, the story was complete from top to bottom. It was well written. It had been edited several times by the California editor, and including the managing editor. And it just never ran. It held for another 3 months. So, and I heard from one of my sources at USC who didn't know the nature of the story. I didn't share it with him because he wasn't in an area where I would be comfortable with that. His expertise wasn't in the medical school. But he told me that the president of the university then, Max Nikias, was telling his top staff that there could be an embarrassing story coming, but it's not going to come before or during the book festival. That same source later told me that Nikias, sometime down the road, also said that this story is not going to run before commencement, and it didn't. It ran in the middle of the summer.
So 3 months prior to the festival, you say that's when the story was ready to publish. It had gone through the additional rigorous editing that your editors wanted, and yet it did not run. In your opinion, was that version of the story better than what you had were ready to submit a few months earlier?
Well, again, the first story was based on the records and the interviews I got from Pasadena, as well as USC's silence, which is a very important part of the story. And that is a routine story to publish. And then that leads to another story and another story. I've been doing this. That's my approach. I like to do run and gun investigations where you go with what you have, knowing that it's going to lead to something bigger. They killed that story. And they did not, encourage us to, they didn't even know about the team for a couple of weeks, more than a couple of weeks. We did that in secret. But once we found the woman who was unidentified in the first story, and that required some luck. Finally, her name popped up in a LexisNexis search associated with an address that was associated with the dean. If that hadn't happened, and I don't know how it happened, Nexis wouldn't tell me, it could have been a parking ticket, a credit report, we might not be talking. That story might have never run. But anyway, once we found her and we got the photos and videos and got everybody on the record, that story was ready to go. And that was before, this was in now late March, early to mid-April. And it did not run for another 3 months. And when it finally did run, at the very last minute, the top editors took out the most damaging material to USC, and that is that Puliafito, the dean, was regularly providing drugs to this circle of young people, these vulnerable young people. He wasn't just doing drugs with them, he was trafficking in drugs. All of that came out at the very last minute, no discussion, and obviously if that stayed in, it would have made the story much better. And they took other things out along the way. They tried to take out the whistleblower until we threatened to, again, go to corporate and complain, and they restored the whistleblower. So yeah, by far, the superior version of the story was the late March, early April version.
And the dean stepped down approximately what time frame was it when he abruptly resigned?
He stepped down about 3 weeks after the overdose. And he and the university lied about it. They put out a statement saying that, well, he's going to pursue a great opportunity in the private sector. And that wasn't true, as we later reported. But he remained on faculty, he continued to treat patients, perform surgeries, and he continued to use drugs and provide drugs to others. In April, I complained to the managing editor that we now have an ethical responsibility to get this story published. I did that after speaking to ethicists about the dean. How bad is this behavior? And they agreed that it was very bad, but they said that LA Times also has a responsibility to publish this story with dispatch because people are being hurt. They didn't care. The story still stayed out of the paper for another 3 months.
Just so some of our viewers and listeners understand, now a college newspaper sort of in many cases operates completely independently of the university. Am I right? And is that the case with the college paper at USC?
I believe it is, but I don't have any expertise on that. But generally, they're supposed to operate independently. It's the whole point of having a newspaper.
So I'm just wondering here, thinking out loud. Work with me on this. The dean, this most prominent dean, who's instrumental or at least claims to have raised $1 billion, abruptly resigns. How does the office of the president or the communications people at USC get away with not really answering it? And do you know if the school paper was pursuing something like that? And I realize they may have not been your direct competition in, part of the drug part of it and some of the other details, but the dean of the school resigns. There had to have been some probing happening internally about, wow, this is interesting. What's he going off to?
I have no idea what the student paper was doing at that point. We ran a little brief on it, um, literally just a brief, repeating this lie that he was stepping down because of an opportunity he was pursuing. But I got the tip shortly after that. So I was on the story then. And again, I encountered these cover-ups at both institutions. But I go back to the original story that I filed. I mean, it took too long because of these stonewalling efforts by USC and Pasadena, but I did get the story, and it should have run then. It should have run 9 months, 8 or 9 months before the story before anything about this finally made the paper.
In your career as an investigation reporter, um, what would you say would be the second longest story to publish for you?
I never had, well, we had another USC story took way too long to publish. It eventually was published, and it wasn't gutted like this one was at the last minute. And that was on the athletic director, Pat Hayden, and the fact that he managed to take over this charity that had been set up years earlier, decades earlier, to help poor kids, with scholarships and whatnot. And he ended up paying himself and his relatives these outrageous sums to oversee the charity. That took way too long to publish. We complained about it, my colleague and I, and eventually it was published. But other than that, I just never experienced anything like this in my career. There really isn't a number two. I mean, in every other case of an investigative story, we published a story when it was ready to go, when it had been fact-checked, legally vetted. Again, do all stories have every answer to every question? No, we don't do it that way. If we have a story that's ready to go, that's important, we publish it. And that just didn't happen in this case.
In the process of writing the book, did you go to any of the subjects, to let them know that you've written about them, and ask them in advance of writing the book for feedback or comment, or did any of the subjects read any part of the book in advance of it being published?
Well, no, I reached out to people who were in the book, including the 3 editors who were fired, and they wouldn't give me an interview. They just threatened me with lawsuits, which led to nothing, absolutely nothing. I did reach out to the president of the university and to Puliafito, the other doctor the book is about, his lawyer. And again, my colleagues, they were aware of what the fact-checking certainly included them, and they vouched for everything in the book that occurred with these editors in the newsroom. So yeah, it was a very thorough, time-consuming job over a period of months.
And yet, in some of the rebuttals to the book, people have gone to length, some of these former editors, defending their role in how they edited the story, and then sort of basically saying that they won't even read the book. So they're defending something that they don't even know how it was.
One of them actually denied allegations that he assumed were in the book about him, and they weren't, which was hilarious. They're just not telling the truth. They got fired. They're embarrassed. They're in lesser positions now. The book isn't kind to them. I mean, this happens in all the investigative stories I do, virtually. Not that I get threatened with lawsuits, and that after it comes out, they say the story isn't true, the targets of the story. So there's nothing new here. They just happen to be journalists, which is, disappointing. But yeah, and they've raised things like, well, they were waiting for a copy of prescription. In one of the managing editor said he was still waiting for it. He and the investigations editor were waiting for it in May. I had it in March. It was already in the story. They said they needed a phone record. I got it within hours of them asking for it. Whatever they asked for, they got immediately. And they still didn't publish the story. And again, when they did, they took the most damaging material about USC out of the story at the last minute. Again, no meeting with the reporters, no discussion, no journalistic reason. And in fact, they lied about it. They told me that it was the newsroom lawyer who, directed that this material come out. And that's not true. They ordered him to take it out. So that's who we're dealing with.
Let's fast forward to today. The result of the story, and then the subsequent story about the gynecologist, and now the book. What has changed at the LA Times? What has changed at USC?
Well, at the LA Times, it's night and day. After those editors were fired, we had no trouble getting USC stories into the paper, including the George Tyndall story, which was, certainly as hard-hitting and probably riskier legally. And we got that. That story was published within 3 weeks of us filing a draft. 3 weeks. And that used to be normal at the LA Times, and it's normal again. We have a new owner who has done tremendous civic service by building up the paper. He's hired, I think, 130 or more journalists. We have a good leadership in the newsroom. We have support for these kinds of stories from the beginning. So yeah, it's night and day. At USC, again, it's more of a mixed situation in my view. I still encounter a lack of transparency, including on this subject. I did a couple of follow-up stories last year where the president wouldn't engage with me in any meaningful way. And I hear, there's still things going on at USC that are problematic. So I think there's room for more improvement there, certainly more openness.
I found it alarming that you point out that the USC has a board of trustees that 57 members, and then of them, a few are on the executive committee, and it wasn't even public which of them, other than the president and the chair of the board of trustees, were publicly known to be on the executive committee. From a leadership standpoint, that is really baffling.
It's just extraordinary. I never heard of anything like that. It was a secret executive committee for the most part.
Now, the chair, or the then chair of the board of trustees, is now running for mayor of Los Angeles and has taken some credit in how he's tried to right things at USC. Would you comment on some of that?
Well, I addressed that in the book. I mean, this was now, again, one scandal led to the other in terms of our reporting. We got the story published finally on the dean. We did a number of follow-up stories, and that led to my colleague Harriet Ryan getting the tip on the second doctor, George Tyndall, the campus gynecologist, who we learned had allegedly been abusing women for decades, and the complaints about him went nowhere internally. So, after the first scandal broke, Rick Caruso was not the chair of the board at the time. He did make a comment about how this wasn't a good thing, drug use, but he didn't do anything much beyond that. I mean, he didn't call for the resignation of the president. Again, they hired this law firm just to look into all of this with promises that they would be transparent about it, and they weren't transparent. The report that was produced by the law firm was never publicly released. And, that was on his watch as a trustee. Now, after the Tyndall story broke, as Bad City points out, he did lead the effort to have Max Nikias removed as president. He wasn't exactly fired. He was sort of pushed out, but he remained on the faculty. He continues to hold the title of President Emeritus. I think he has a non-voting seat on the board. He was given a very generous financial package. So I'll leave that to others to decide if that's, cleaning things up. But there were other members of the board who didn't even want to do that. They wanted Nikias to remain as president even after the George Tyndall scandal, and even though we're now in the middle of the Me Too movement.
Talk about the young group of journalists that helped you, especially at USC. I'd love to hear more about their backgrounds and what it felt like for them to be part of this larger, big investigative story.
Well, yeah, again, after the story was killed, Matt Late, Shelby Grabden, the California editor, and we put together this team, this secret team. And I insisted that at least 2 of the 4 other members be USC grads. I thought that was important just for, the purposes of moral weight. But did they have to do this? No. None of the reporters had to get involved in this. They knew how bad things were with management. They knew the story had been killed. They had no reason to believe that the story wouldn't be killed again and that they would be punished for helping me try to get it published. So they were very courageous in joining this effort. And they did not even hesitate. They did not even hesitate. And if they had told me no, I would have been perfectly understanding of that. Absolutely. And they did tremendous work. You know, we fanned out across Southern California, knocking on doors. Once I found out the identity of the woman, they immediately put together a profile of her and some of the people around her based on court records and other documents. Again, we partnered up to go out and knock on doors together. I mean, it was a tremendous reporting job. And I have to repeat, we did that fairly quickly. Again, once the name of Sarah Warren popped up in a public record, things moved very quickly. And we had, I'm estimating now, I think we had the really solid best story within 3 to 4 weeks. But it didn't run for another 3 months.
Let's shift over to the Pasadena Police Department. Is an entity like USC just too big to take on? Does an institution like the Pasadena Police Department sort of tread carefully? And if so, why?
Well, again, I would be speculating about that, but I can just say that how the Pasadena Police Department handled this matter was unprecedented in my very long career. You have a woman who is unconscious. There are drugs in the room, methamphetamine. She's rushed to the hospital. The room is registered to the dean. The drugs are in his room. And there's not even a police report filed. They even filed an evidence report, to log the meth, into evidence, but they didn't do a police report. The interview of Puliafito, we later got a recording of that, was perfunctory. It wasn't exactly a grilling. I never found any evidence that they attempted to get a search warrant for his car or his house. Of course, he was never arrested. So why? You have to ask yourself, why is that? Well, USC does cast a long shadow over Pasadena. There are a lot of ties between the city and the university that go back forever. Is that a factor? Well, in our business, it's not just a conflict of interest that should be a concern. It's the appearance of a conflict of interest. And when I filed my complaint against our editors, that's what I pointed out, that the ties between the university and the newspaper, and combined with the fact that we can't get this story published, that could create at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. And we can't afford that. We have to always maintain our readers' trust. And I don't think a police department or a university can afford that either. But you can't blame people if that's the conclusion they draw.
Back to the LA Times, there was in one of the comments, it was suggested that you did not have the greatest relationship with Maharaj, and that there was some LA Magazine piece that came out earlier, sort of critical of his leadership. And do you think any of that contributed to working under him, working with him?
It might have. I mean, I did have for quite a long time a very good relationship with him. He was my friend. But once he became the editor-in-chief, things just went downhill. And not with me, but with the staff. They had a problem with the entire staff, with very, very few exceptions. And that bled into others on the masthead, including the managing editor. So, yeah, our relationship, it had gone to, like, again, and then the LA Magazine piece, that came out I think the month before they killed the USC story. So, who knows? But, you're supposed to set these things aside. You can have disputes in a newsroom. You could not like each other that much, but you get the story published. And this wasn't a financial story. This wasn't a political story. This is a story about this physician trafficking in drugs, providing them to young people, including a minor in one case, which is something they took out of the story as well before it was published, that he was providing meth to a 17-year-old. They took that out even though we had it cold on the record. So you don't let newsroom disputes get in the way of publishing something like this. You do that and you fail your mission.
How long did it take before his medical license got called into question, or did it?
It did it. Well, they opened up an investigation immediately after the story. I think the day the story was published, the medical board, and then they suspended it. And they finally took it away, I believe, the following May. It took 10 months or so to, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. Um, so yeah, that was fairly, yeah, that's what happened. So that when that story landed, his medical career was essentially over.
And do you think that process did it take sort of the right amount of time? Was there
Well,
does the medical board like that sort of is it concerned to be protective of a prominent physician at a prominent institution in your mind, or did that sort of take its natural flow?
well, my colleagues have done great reporting on the failings of the medical board to go after bad doctors. In this case, they really didn't have much of a choice. He was on the front page of the LA Times, and again, we had one follow-up story after another about him and how people look the other way inside the university and so forth. So it's my guess that they might have moved even quicker than they normally do on this because of all the publicity. And he was no longer, as far as we know, treating patients during the time it took them to schedule a hearing and actually formally revoke his license.
Have you heard from anyone at USC since the book has been published?
Only from faculty members, students, and others who were very glad that I wrote the book.
Was there any formal denial or challenge to
Formal
anything in the
denial,
book from USC?
nothing.
Is there anything you might do differently in the book or the investigation?
That I might do differently?
Yeah.
Yes, there is. I should have complained much sooner about how the editors were keeping the story out of the paper. I was going back and forth with myself. If I complained, will that make things even worse and no story would ever be published? I should have given the people in HR more credit up front about how they would handle this, because they did handle it very well. They took it very seriously. They did a very thorough investigation. They fired these people, and we got, and again, after that, and this was after the story was finally published, but that just cleared the way for more reporting without these kinds of roadblocks. So if I had to do it over, I would have gone to corporate much earlier, weeks if not months earlier.
Were they fired directly related to this investigation, or were there sort of other things building up?
Well, they claimed they weren't fired at all. They were reorganized or something like that, although they were fired immediately after the end of the investigation. And it was an asymmetrical reorganization when they're firing the top two guys, but then somebody much lower on the totem pole, and this person and that person. But were other complaints made about them during the investigation? Absolutely. Absolutely. So it started off as the USC situation. That went on for quite some time. And then the floodgates opened, and that was after they attempted to essentially demote one of the editors who promoted the story. We saw that as retaliation. They denied that. But anyway, that opened the investigation further, and dozens of employees came forward to complain about their leadership, particularly the top two editors. The other editor, the investigation editor, had only been at the paper about 5 months, but he supported them. He did their bidding, and he got fired too.
Um, just for those who are not sort of privy to the inner workings of a newspaper, you're an investigative reporter. You'll dive into something, and it can be months before you have anything to publish. Am I right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Walk us through what your daily routines might be. I mean, you must go down a whole lot of rabbit holes where you get nothing, and then maybe you find something.
That's what happens. And sometimes you get lucky. I did an investigation some years ago that led to a very prominent labor leader being indicted and going to federal prison. That initial story only took me about 6 weeks. Things just came together for me. Other times, no. I mean, and it's almost always because the institution or the person you're looking at is covering something up. and you got to break through that. And our stuff has to be absolutely perfect. We don't go after people. Every word in a story has to be unassailable, and that can take a lot of time if you're not getting any cooperation. That happens routinely, and the daily routine, there really isn't one. I mean, I will, some days I'll get a bunch of records all of a sudden, and that will keep me busy for a week or more. Other days, doors are slammed in my face all over town, and I get nowhere. It can be very frustrating, but you just have to be persistent. And in only a few cases was I unable to get a story that I knew was true and was important, but I just couldn't quite nail it down. But again, if you keep banging away, usually things happen.
So when a writer at a paper like the LA Times, and actually more specifically at the LA Times, you choose to write a book about the goings on of what happened, sort of a larger aspect of a story that you've published. What role does the paper have in having an early look at the book? Do they have a look at the book at all? Do they have any say in what you put in such a thing, or is that an independent relationship between you and the publisher?
Yeah, it's an independent relationship. I didn't set out to write a book. I mean, the idea was pitched to me by my literary agent. I resisted it. I didn't want to relive all of this, but he finally persuaded me that it was important enough to do a book, and it can only be done. The big story, the full story, could only be told in a book. And we talk a lot about the problems inside the newsroom, but that's really the minority of the story, as you know. I mean, the other institutions, the university, the police department, the district attorney's office. And it's also the personal story of these people who got caught up in these scandals. And again, there's no way to do justice to that fully unless you're going to do a book. And that's how I did it. But yeah, it was a completely independent project.
Some of the criticism I saw, and again, relates to people's unfamiliarity with the type of articles in a newspaper. There was criticisms to a book review about the content of the book, which is a feature story might be something a little different, but I found that a little surprising. Could you explain that to our listeners?
Again, it came from these fired editors. They were even going after book reviewers who praised the book. I can explain it. That's all it is. The book hit them hard, and they're trying to preserve or restore their reputations, so they're lashing out, even at book reviewers. And threatening lawsuits. They threatened lawsuits over excerpts that were published from the book. The thing to remember is none of it meant anything. Not a single word has been changed in the book or ever will be changed because of these attacks. And they're coming from a small number of people and echoed by a small number of people.
Advice to a young college student or someone in high school about to embark on that next stage in life, and they're thinking they want to go into journalism. Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
And
you're not going to get rich. You're going to have trouble paying your rent even, but it's certainly a very rewarding profession, and it's a critically important one, as you know, more so now than ever.
And best suggestion for a young person to prepare for a career in journalism?
Of course, journalism school. I added journalism as a major in my last year as a second major. I was going to go to law school. Then I went to grad school and majored in journalism. It's not absolutely necessary. It certainly helps. I think the broader your experiences, the more you bring to journalism, just your life experiences. I think that's important. For the majority of my career, I was not an investigative reporter. I was a general assignment writer and a bureau chief. So I wrote about everything. And when I decided to focus on investigative reporting, that really helped me because I had this broader, background and knowledge that I could bring to an investigation. And that's also important when you deal with people. Empathy is critically important for an investigative reporter, building trust with the people who are giving you information at risk to themselves. Which brings me back to Bad City. I mean, the heroes in that book include certainly the whistleblowers who came forward not for any kind of personal gain or anything. They came forward just to do the right thing. So getting to the point where you can build trust with folks like that is very important, and that takes time. If you're young, just getting into the business, that takes you learn by doing. But I'd say one thing that hasn't changed about investigative journalism, journalism in general, is that the best stories come from people, not from records, not from the internet, not from algorithms. All of those things can produce very good stories, but the best stories eventually come down to people. Finding people who have the information, who will bring the story to life in a way that a document can't. So I encourage young people, get off the screen, get off the phone, go out into the field, knock on doors. In that vein, nowadays, it's funny because the web certainly makes it easier to do research. And all the communications devices we have now give us a variety of methods to communicate with sources. But it's still best to, in my view, whenever you can, do things the old-fashioned way, a notebook and a pen in a face-to-face interview if you're dealing with something sensitive. Just because
Paul, who were some of your mentors very early in your career?
Very, very early in my career. Well, Bob Poole, he was a reporter at the LA Times. We started off together at a newspaper that no longer exists in Thousand Oaks. He was a mentor. I've had very good editors over the years, going back to when I was the bureau chief for Copley newspapers in Los Angeles, the Dallas Morning News. Pam Maples was my editor there, Ed Duffner, great editor, Mary Carter. And I've had very good editors at the LA Times. Linda Rogers stands out, Steve Padilla. My editor now is fantastic, Jack Leonard. Matt Late, I can go on and on. The mentoring continues. The mentoring, I'm still being mentored. I have a story now that I need an editor to look at to make sure I didn't get too close to it and it works. So, and I'll take something from that. I'll learn something from that.
In closing, where is the young woman in the story? Where is she today?
Sarah is back with her family in Texas. She's doing better. She does plan to get back into school. She's very bright. I mean, she has a lot to offer. She's clean. So there's a lot of good news there. But the damage this guy did to the family, it can, it's lasting. It's very lasting. Her brother is also doing better than he was when I completed the book. He's back in school as well. So, they're doing better, but justice hasn't been done for them, not completely.
Speaking of justice, are you surprised how much the dean has gotten away with?
Yes, absolutely. I can't explain it to people.
Are you aware that is it too late? Is it over?
I couldn't say. I mean, I heard not long ago that there'd been another complaint made to the district attorney's office about him. They haven't shared anything with me, so I can't say. But it's extraordinary that he engaged in this behavior for such a long period of time, and there really were no consequences apart from losing his medical license and his job. And again, the book gets into the death of the baby. And there was an investigation into that. Again, he wasn't prosecuted. So I can't explain it.
Well, thanks for your time, Paul. It's great to talk to you. The book again is Bad City, Peril and Power in the City of Angels.
Thank
Available wherever books are sold.
you.
Thanks again.
Appreciate it.